right, welcome to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast. We are again coming to you from Down Under this week, and I am thrilled to be joined by Ian McKay, who is joining us. Ian is the cloud principal at Kablamo, which is a cloud product development and data consultancy specializing in building applications native to the cloud. He's usually focused on cloud architecture, CI/CD, and security, but is always trying out the latest cloud services. Between helping clients, he loves the chance to build open source projects. We're going to talk about a couple of his open source projects. But his projects have a heavy focus on cloud automation and tooling. Ian also enjoys speaking at meetups, co-hosting podcasts, engaging with the community on Slack, and posting his latest experiences within the cloud on his blog. A couple of the projects that you may know Ian from are Console Recorder, Former 2, IAM Live, which I assume is related to IAM. We'll come to that in a little bit. Permissions.cloud and IAM Dataset. Ian is also an AWS ambassador and community hero. I'm not sure where you find the time for all of that, Ian, but I do appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy.
Awesome. Well, I've got a bunch of things that I want to get into today and definitely want to talk about some of your open source projects. But before we get into that, I know one of the questions that I've had a chance to chat with you offline a little bit about is building secure solutions for customers with strong regulatory compliance requirements. And I'm curious, as you've been doing this for a number of years, I wonder if there's any kind of main lessons that you've learned over the years around kind of, let's say, like walking the fine line of moving quickly in the cloud, but then staying compliant. What are some of the things you've learned?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the main lessons I've learned as a consultant is that every customer has very different needs, very different requirements, and levels of technical competency. Okay. A lot of customers are really far along on their cloud journey and experiencing a lot of different new ideas. And a lot of them are really just coming out of on-prem and doing just the bare basics to get them through. So it's about, I sometimes have to change the way I talk to my customers to figure out, what would best suit them in their specific use case.
So, not to kind of oversimplify it, but is it fair to say that, you've got some customers who have, let's say, maybe just executed the lift and shift and haven't really embraced cloud ops as we might think about it today, and those that are all then at the other end of the spectrum. And so then as a result of that, how you figure out your approach really has to vary widely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a lot of customers that are still in that serverful mindset of having their pets in the cloud and things like that, and not embracing immutable infrastructure, things like that. And there's some customers that are really at the bleeding edge and doing some really interesting cloud native style applications.
Well, I'm curious for those that are at that bleeding edge and building kind of cloud native. And, that was one of the things in the intro that we talked about is you've been doing cloud native for a long time. And so for those that are at that end of the spectrum, how do you talk to them about balancing speed and compliance? Because they're probably, because they are at that bleeding edge, they're probably used to moving really quickly.
Yeah, usually it's really about having a discussion with them about their risk tolerances. So I always find it really helpful to go through that standard risk matrix about what is the likelihood of a specific risk or incident happening versus the impact that it has. And that really helps me understand how fast are they willing to move versus how bad would it be if they move too fast and broke things. A lot of customers are very happy to even have production downtime or things like that. And a lot of customers will spend 6 months testing a deployment just to make sure it's exactly right. So there's a lot of differences in that space, and I generally find that establishing the boundaries within a cloud environment between your different environments helps them achieve some sort of a balance between their agility and their stability. So having lower environments, being a little bit more agile, maybe allowing more permissions to interact with those sort of environments, and then taking a hands-off approach in those higher style environments.
And along those lines, do you find that there is a firm understanding about where security and compliance overlap versus where they diverge? Or do you feel like that conversation gets pretty blurry for customers that are moving quickly but do have strong regulatory requirements?
Yeah, so there's always this, I guess, conflict about what they have to do for their regulatory and compliance programs, things like ISO 27001, SOC 2, etc., and even in their own internal programs versus what they can achieve. I feel like both the companies and the compliance programs are really doing a very good job at covering off all the major areas, and especially with the idea of regular enforcement. So making sure that not only are there controls in place, but they're being tested and they're going through it all the time. What I find they sometimes fall down on is practicality. So having auditors come in and not really caring about how controls are met, or when controls are met in a non-standard way, and they sometimes get confused or disagree that specific needs are met, despite the organization really doing the legwork and saying, no, yes, we've done all this work to make sure that this is covered off. So it's a little bit of inconsistency with their application of rules and things like that.
Yeah, and there's a lot that comes to mind as you talk about that inconsistency. I mean, first of all, kind of the graduated scale of risk tolerance for different environments, right? So if we think about, to your example, tolerating a somewhat higher level of risk in, let's say, dev test or even in staging environments where we might not have customer data, we shouldn't have customer data, right? And we also probably have some kind of network layer controls that maybe don't make those environments public. They're only for internal usage, they're only for internal testing, et cetera. Maybe staging has some external exposure to kind of simulate what public attacks against an environment might mean from a security perspective. But one of the things that I found in a lot of the work that I've done is that turning that off as you get higher and higher up the stack into production environments can lead to a somewhat disjointed experience where you have where customers come to expect a certain level of access in an environment, and then as you get stricter and stricter, that can be hard for them to internalize in their operations. You must have gone through a similar journey with certain customers. How did you explain to them, like, no, the controls are this for dev, this for prod, and here's why?
I think the way that I tend to pitch this is about their own protection and always working with them, their guidelines and their requirements to get as much understanding and access that they can achieve without then compromising them. So I'll always ask, what is the main pain points for your developers, or what are you seeing that is costing you a lot of time? And we'll try and work around those things with various different tricks and hacks. But a lot of the time, it's just simply a conversation of, look, you don't want this. You don't want this level of access because then you're liable for this. And sometimes that's a hard conversation to have, but it's a conversation that we need to do.
Yeah. And do you find that you've been able to develop something of a templated approach to this over the years, where you can maybe go into a customer, have a conversation with them to assess what their risk tolerance level is, assess what their regulatory requirements are, and then maybe come out with something of a blueprint for, okay, you need landing zones that look like this, you need an AWS org that looks like this with these service control policies, and maybe control tower to deploy this set of accounts with these governance rules and so on? Or do you find that it's still, it is pretty bespoke for each customer engagement that you go into?
Yeah, so we definitely have a lot of bootstrap templates and things like that. A lot of that vary in complexity based on the customer. We usually know the level of competence with a customer kind of walking in the door. So we can start the conversation pretty well on there as we start, and then manipulate that from there. But yes, absolutely. We have a number of different approaches that we take internally, and that's good for our own standardization as well. So when we're handing off to support teams and things like that, if we're supporting a customer post-production, then everyone knows what it kind of looks like. Everyone sees the same patterns, the same places to look. And so it's a lot easier to triage and debug issues.
And do you find, one of the things that I've always found working with customers over the year on security is it's a lot easier, or it can be a lot easier to actually start from zero. Even if a customer has gone down, let's say gone 50, 60, 70% of the way down what you might think of as a cloud journey path, and they're 2/3 to all the way migrated to the cloud, if they haven't baked security into, let's say, the designs of their account structures or their permissions boundaries or things like that, it can often be easier to, kind of start fresh with a new organizational structure and, again, those service control policies and whatnot that we talked about, and then actually do a cloud to cloud migration. Is that something that you run across a lot, or you find that now most of the time for customers, if they've kind of started that migration journey, they really want to kind of retrofit, clean up the environments that they're working in already?
Usually we would get to that point where it's already that far gone. So if we can usually retrofit an existing architecture within, reasonable means to get it to where it needs to be. We did this a lot when AWS Control Tower came out, and that had a bunch of standardized practices, and now we had to figure out what is the customer actually doing versus what is this service providing, and then kind of retrofitting that in, which is its own set of challenges. But usually the types of customers that we speak to are usually engaging in either greenfield projects or don't have the technical level of competency that they want to have any say in it whatsoever. So you will usually come in and dictate to them, this is your groundwork layer, these are your guardrails, etc. And they're very happy with that because they're taking that subject matter expertise from us to make sure that they are secure in the way they work.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we found pretty consistently over the last, I guess, 8 years or so that I've been working on cloud security, is that very often customers don't know what they don't know. And so a lot of the times, to your point, they're very happy for somebody to come in and help kind of dictate requirements to them, because it can be very informative, right? Especially if they're coming out of, let's say, legacy data center type of architectures, they may often have a strong focus on, let's say, perimeter-oriented security and monitoring as, the next kind of pillar of a security strategy. And monitoring can be particularly challenging in very ephemeral environments where things are changing on a regular basis. Installing the agent, or even if you're not using an agent full service, but you're using an agentless service, assigning the ephemeral infrastructure to the workload so that you can have a consistent level of monitoring over time. All of that can be very challenging if you don't know what you're kind of doing and how to do that. And it really leads into one of the next topics I want to talk to you about is infrastructure as code. Because I think the only way to really manage that effectively is with infrastructure as code, especially if you are doing a lot of ephemeral things with agentless architectures. So you, I guess, built and maintain, I don't know if you're one of the only builders or you're the only builder, but Former 2, I kind of came across as one of your open source projects. I mean, talk to us a little bit about it. What was the origin story? What problem did you set out to solve?
Sure. So I guess Former 2 is the second in a line of products that I primarily built and maintain. The first of which is called Console Recorder for AWS. That first one, Console Recorder for AWS, was actually built out of my own frustration of, I can actually tell you the exact call. It was Medialize Create Channel Call, which if you look at the Bodo docs for like 6 pages long or something like that, it's just massive amount of parameters and things like that I needed for that. And I found myself going into the network tab of the console to try and figure out what exactly are these parameters and figuring out how my console actions mapped to what these API calls needed to do. And so I took that as an idea and made with the first product called Console Recorder for AWS, which is a browser extension which records the actions you take within the AWS console and then converts that to Bodo 3 or CloudFormation or Terraform and things like that. And so I wanted to generate these infrastructure as code or even just scripts so I can understand what the console is actually doing. And that turned out to be very popular, but the common ask I got from that was, well, I've already had my employee over there create this infrastructure, or I forgot to press record because it's a very live thing. What about my existing resources? And that's why I've moved from that project into Former 2, which I currently maintain today. And Former 2 basically does a scan of your account. So that's like list and get calls. This is done
Yep.
entirely locally. So there's no server that I manage or anything else like that. It's just it's your PC to the AWS endpoints. And basically just
again through a browser plugin or
it's basically just through a website. So you can just view a website as a static website, and you can see the calls that are going out to the AWS website, to the AWS endpoints. You provide credentials and things like that, and it'll go and pull in that data. And it takes those list and get calls and then converts that again to your infrastructure as code, your CloudFormation, Terraform, Pulumi, CDK, things like that, so that you can figure out what you've created in the AWS environment. So that's by CLI or by not just ClickOps, but like API calls or things like that.
Yeah.
And then start to convert that into your infrastructure as code so you can have that immutable stack-based design, which is, I think, a super effective tool, not only for taking your ClickOps work and bringing it in, but also educating yourself on what specific fields are doing what in the environment, and when you might not necessarily know a property or something like that in your infrastructure as code. That's a really good way to figure that out.
And does it take into account the order of operation? So if I'm, building a classic 3-tier architecture, database, app server, web server, or, web layer, whatever that ends up being, I know that, the RDS instance needs to come up first so that there is a database server that the app server can connect to and instantiate the database tables or whatever the exact sequence of operations is. That's all kind of built into this Former 2 approach? Yeah,
absolutely. So either within Terraform's attribute controls or with CloudFormation's intrinsic functions that your ref and your get at, it basically looks at the known outputs, whether that's IDs and ARNs, figures out that that's actually present in another resource, and then automatically does the mapping for you, which is an interesting programming challenge to solve, basically writing out the graph of the thing you just scanned. But once I got it working, it's super effective and very cool.
It's really interesting. And I mean, not to go down too deep of a rabbit hole around this, but it's really interesting to me that you use the word graph when you're talking about that, because I know there's a few of us who have been in the cloud community for a long time, I'm sure yourself included, that tend to think about workloads as actually being collections of resources with these intrinsic connections to each other, and all of that being represented by a graph. And that graph concept is increasingly being adopted on the cybersecurity side when you think about things like one of the most modern, I think modern in kind of air quotes here, but one of the most common ways that people are analyzing their cloud security posture right now is through a combination of attack paths and blast radiuses, right? And an attack path is kind of, from, let's say, a vulnerability on an EC2 instance X, what else can I get to? Or what is the path towards exploiting an environment? And then the blast radius is kind of, the maximum exposure from that. Was security in your mind when you created Former 2, or was it, kind of something that you think really is kind of off to the side? You're really focused on the infrastructure side of it.
Yeah, I think when I was creating it, I was focused entirely on the infrastructure. Security was on my mind in that I knew that I personally would never, or would be reluctant to give access to my cloud environment to third-party vendors and things like that. So I actually went out of my way, and it's actually really annoying to have it such that this is a static thing that I never see the usage of it or what people are doing with the tool, because I've specifically said, I don't want to be involved in this. This is a direct call that you make with the cloud provider. So that was always in my mind. But as far as the idea of visualizing infrastructure in a graph, I think that's one of the fundamental things that really helps your understanding of infrastructure as code when you get into that space, because it starts to make you think about the relationships and the life cycle of events. One of the biggest questions that people always talk about is how should I lay out my stacks or my templates or things like that? And it really comes down to the life cycle of your infrastructure. If this is a static style infrastructure,
Yeah.
everything that relates to that piece of static material, so that might be a database or something like that, should be in its own stack. But if you have something like a Lambda where it's very ephemeral in nature and can update and things like that, it should be separate as far as the stack management side of things goes, because you don't want to have those two things be affected in the same way.
Yeah. But I'm curious along those lines, when you think about kind of laying out stacks, where do you think a stack should start and end? And I'll kind of explain what I mean and get your opinion on it, right? So over the years in talking to, I don't know how many hundreds of customers about cloud security and their overall cloud security strategy, I've seen kind of two approaches, right? And so one is two general, like high level approaches. So one is more the kind of, you know, command and control, and you kind of can't do it unless it's explicitly allowed. And you can think of that as kind of the service catalog type of approach, et cetera. But one of the other approaches that I've seen within larger organizations that are fast moving, and maybe I should qualify, like my experiences are usually with larger fast moving cloud environments. The other approach that I've seen is kind of guardrails that usually take the form of, we've laid out a VPC structure and we've laid out IAM roles and policies. And as long as you kind of color within the lines of those two things, you know, you can't really break outside this VPC structure. You can't really violate permission sets that we've applied from these, kind of known good IAM policies. We feel safe as an organization from a risk management perspective. Like when you think about these stacks, do you usually think about stacks incorporating VPCs and IAM roles? And so you really want to like build up the entire network and IAM structure for the stack? Or do you think about them using something out of, let's say, a known good collection of network and identity kind of templates?
Yeah, we usually take the approach, at least within my company, of doing the guardrails approach of having a bunch of borders around what you can and can't do, particularly with things like security services that you can't touch, but given them the freedom to do whatever they need to do to solve their workload. I don't think the problem with the service catalog style approach is that you run into this limitation where you become the single point of failure, i.e.
Totally.
And that's probably a bad way of phrasing it, but you have a bunch of teams coming into you saying, we have these new requirements, we want to do X, we want to do Y. Yeah. And then if you don't have that template for you in your service catalog, it's on you to develop that. And that can be a huge bottleneck for the organization. So we definitely take that guardrail style approach as often as we can. Yeah,
that makes total sense. And it's funny, I mean, you know, I tend to think of the former, the service catalog approach, as we used to talk about it a lot as the rock in the river, right? So let's say, imagine you've got a river or a creek or, you know, whatever scale you want it to be, but you've got, let's say, a path of water flowing, and you say, well, hold on, I only want to allow these things to go by it. So you'll put a rock to dam up that water flow. And you can make that rock as big as you want, but eventually what happens is there's erosion around the edges and more water gets by it. And so to your point, if there's not a service catalog offering for the brand new media service that AWS just launched or whatever, you know, you're going to fail at some point, because either the developers and the people who own the workloads get so frustrated that they can't get what they need out of your service catalog, and they just go, you know, the shadow IT route, whip out a credit card, create a new AWS account, whatever, or, you know, they do something that's completely out of your control, which I guess that example kind of is. So awesome. Now, you have a couple of other open source packages. Former 2 is the one that I spent the most time kind of browsing, but you've got IAM Live, or IAM Live, I don't know how you pronounce it, but I assume it's also related to IAM.
Yeah, sure. So IAM Live is a Go application that basically intercepts your calls from your local environment or from your cloud environment, perhaps, on the way to AWS endpoints, and then generates a set of least privilege IAM policies for what you're doing with those services. So you can put that as a client-side monitoring or just a sort of man-in-the-middle proxy approach. And whatever calls go out to the AWS endpoints, during that egress, you're looking at those calls and then I'm basically generating a least privileged template of
Yep.
of the IAM permissions that would be needed to do that again. And so this is really useful for generating, like I said, least privileged policies without saying, ** administrator access, whatever. So you can really scope down what you need to do. It's always funny when you release tools, you never really understand how they're going to be used by the community.
Totally.
Forma 2 has been used as a sort of a whole account, like AWS account catalog tooling, without the infrastructure as code templating as well. So you never really understand how that might work. And IAM Live is almost very frequently used to generate Terraform least privilege roles. So interesting. So Terraform makes calls to the AWS endpoints in order to do its actions. But by doing that, we can intercept those calls and figure out, if I was to deploy this in a cloud account, for example, what would be the role that I have to give Terraform in order to do those deployments? So there's been a lot of work around using it in that use case.
Well, it's interesting because as you were describing it, the use case that popped to my mind was local application development, but using like AWS backend, let's say like S3, RDS, Dynamo, whatever, kind of like for the long-term storage of the data that my app is collecting. And then, narrowing permissions between whatever app service I'm going to use, whether Lambda, some container, or EC2, and those other components. That's where my thinking went on IAM Live. I don't know if that's what your original intention was, but that's how I saw it being used. Because otherwise, to your point, I see developers all the time doing, it's a workload I'm deploying on EC2. I'm just going to give it S3 star and RDS star because I know it needs to, read and write a database and some files.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest. I think it's one of the hardest areas within cloud to get permissions and identity access right. Yep. And the guidance around it is still lacking in some ways.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of work that needs to happen to educate people, because it's a very complex language and it's a very complex thing to work on. To do it to the point where you can eliminate potential lateral movement and things like that should your application actually get compromised.
And you don't find that the IAM policy generator is, I don't know, widely understood enough or good enough? I don't know. I mean,
I just think it's a huge commitment to get to the level that you need to be proficient, what I would consider proficient in it, enough that you can protect yourself adequately. Because there's so many gotchas. Things like the confused deputy problem is not well understood within the cloud community at all. And I think it's a time bomb waiting to happen.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I know there's a couple of other packages that you maintain, and I've got a couple of other questions I'm hoping to get to, but maybe just briefly, permissions cloud and IAM dataset, what would you want to tell the audience about those?
Yeah, sure. So the IAM dataset is basically that mapping of API's actions to IAM permissions. It's being used to drive IAM Live, and permissions cloud is basically a web front end, so it's permissions.cloud as a website. That you can use to view and inspect that data set, so you can understand what permissions would I need if I was to do this API action without actually doing it with your local environment.
Gotcha. Awesome. So I know you do a lot of research on your own as you're kind of building things out, whether for yourself or for clients and whatnot. And I know that's one of the things that I've enjoyed in our conversations is that you've got a wealth of knowledge on things that I probably haven't looked at deeply. One of the ones that I spotted on your blog recently was Cedar. And, Cedar, I guess it's been around for a couple of years at this point. And I'm always curious whenever I see yet another policy language. I mean, I think there's even an acronym for, YARA, yet another rules language or something like that. Like, did we really need another policy language? Have you played with it? What are your thoughts on it so far, like a year and a half, 2 years into its life?
Yeah, I think Cedar really filled a specific niche of that very common problem of I have a simple application that has very basic authorization logic, maybe like an if or two, depending upon if they're an admin or not. And the problem is that grows over time. So you become like, in this case, in this case, in this case. So what this language is really good at doing is starting off with a policy set that can expand over time without actually changing application codes. The idea is you change your policy around like what entities are allowed in and things like that, but without changing your actual application code to achieve those results, and then potentially having misconfigurations. So I think it's pretty good and effective at that. You can run it locally, or AWS are running a service called Verify Permissions to do it for you. There's some slight issues in some like very minor cases. It's got some interesting language features and choices that are a bit suspect in my opinion. But overall, it's a pretty good language or engine for the specific niche use case.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, the kind of the use case that you described there very much sounds to me like how RBAC has gotten, I won't say broken, but you kind of see the limitations of it over time, and it's always with the kind of exceptions, right? It's Ian is a member of the development group, but he's also an admin of this one workload. But I don't want to add him to the admin group because then he gets admin on everything. He's really only an admin on whatever application. And so then you think about this kind of combination of, workload tags plus permission sets. And that's where I've seen a lot of people kind of move away from RBAC and in terms of ABAC. But I think of that more on the infrastructure side. So it sounds like with Cedar, when we talk about the kind of authorization that you're talking about, that's more application layer application layer authorization.
It's intended as an author. It doesn't have to be technically application layer, but I think that's where they're mostly targeting. So it's about, here's your entities, here's your action against your resource. Given all those things, here's a set of rules that apply to whether you're allowed or denied into a specific space. It's very similar to IAM, but has none of the things that are like AWS in IAM, I guess.
Okay, so it's something that you could actually deploy anywhere, not only on AWS or on apps that you're running on AWS.
Yeah, that's the intention. It's like IAM, but anywhere else.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And, I work in the API security space, and one of the common problems in APIs is actually authorization. We will be releasing some research not too long from now. We're just kind of putting the finishing touches on some of it. But authorization problems are responsible for the lion's share of records breached. We could talk about initial breach vectors another time, but authorization is like a huge percentage of it. So hopefully this will help solve it for a lot of those use cases. But also working on the API security space, one of the things I get asked a lot is around WAFs. And aren't WAFs good enough to protect APIs? I noticed you had a post about kind of beating a WAF recently, and it wasn't specific to APIs, but talk us through what you learned there and how did you program a workaround to beat a CAPTCHA? Yeah,
sure thing. So this is actually round 2 I've blogged about in terms of my involvement with the AWS WAF or AWS WAF CAPTCHA feature specifically. In the first round, I did basically a Twitter thread on their quote car maze puzzle. And on the blog, I've done a breakdown on their kind of shape match puzzles. So the idea is that AWS have provided this feature that gives new and creative types of CAPTCHA, not just write what the text says or show me, point to the buses in this picture or something like that. It's about trying to innovate in that space. But I guess the main thing I've gotten from this is that it is extremely hard to make challenges hard for computers, but easy for humans. And this problem is only getting worse with the advent of generative AI and the amount of image recognition and audio recognition and all sorts of new features that we have available to us now. It's getting so harder to differentiate at a challenge tooling level to do this.
And so you kind of basically reverse engineered the movements of the car through the maze. Or I guess that was maybe V1 of your programming, but you kind of reverse engineered what the transformation was from the initial puzzle to the final puzzle, and kind of from that then extrapolated. It almost sounded like a bit of triangulation from what I read to kind of determine the positional movements that led to solving the puzzle.
Yeah, it was interesting. In the car maze, it was all around. Here's a route that it takes on a map. Where would it end up? And it was all about looking at the 3D geometry, looking at where colors were, and making assumptions based on its movement, i.e., it can't drive back on itself and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting programming challenges. With the shape match, it's all about matching top half and bottom half of shapes together. And that one is all about lining up vertices from a basically per pixel perspective, and trying every different combination, see what actually fit, and then making a bunch of rules and heuristics around what is valid and what isn't valid in order to come up with the right answer. So that's all programmatic as well. So it's you run a script and it's done in half a second or whatever.
And you didn't find that you got blocked by trying to kind of reverse engineer this due to volume of calls or frequency of calls or things like that?
Well, the interesting thing is you can work on this offline in most of the cases. For this specific feature, a lot of it is around a very limited set of possible circumstances and things like that. So it's somewhat easy to work on it, even offline. So basically just taking maybe 10 challenges or something like that and bringing them offline. But even like online, if you do it enough, then sure, you might get blocked for a few minutes or so, but it's going to come back. So humans make mistakes just as much as computers. So there has to be sort of a leeway in both areas.
I mean, arguably humans make more mistakes than computers, right? But that's neither here nor there. It's interesting though, this is a challenge specifically designed to prevent computers from solving it. And yet what we find is, it doesn't take that much to find a technical solution if one can be found. What's interesting for us, and I mean, not to digress again on too big of a tangent, but in our own testing in our labs where we stand up APIs on a regular basis for, pen testing, security testing purposes, we see a ton of automated traffic coming to them, a lot of bots and so on. Any protective technology that gets developed, that gets widely enough deployed, will get automated against. So if this WAF capture becomes a common protection mechanism, it won't be long before the hacker's automation will also have solutions to then solving these puzzles. Because we see the nature of the traffic that we see in the attempted automated attacks clearly shows us that, the break-in capabilities are there.
Yep. And it's even human labor is cheap. Like the most common capture technology out there, reCAPTCHA, you can get $2 per 1,000 solves for that. So that's going to be worth an attacker's time or to do it even at large scale for the benefit they get out of it. And so I think what we really need to do is stop thinking about this as a challenge problem and start thinking about other solutions to this to this problem. So thinking about what is the frequency of attacks, what are our IP ranges, looking at bot-like activity unrelated to the actual challenge solution itself. So using a combination of these factors together is what's going to help things over time.
Yeah, look, and I mean, from our perspective, I would double down on a couple of things, which is, building stronger authentication and authorization into your applications and hardening your applications before they even go live, whether that is eliminating third-party vulnerabilities, CVE, doing stronger security analysis of your own source code and what you're building, bug bounties, whatever you can do to kind of harden your application structure and kind of, I would say avoid the mental trap of thinking that you can protect away your problems by slapping a Band-Aid WAF on top of it before it goes live, because I think there's enough evidence out there that WAFs can be defeated.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, listen, we've kind of come up to the end of time, Ian. I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us today, for sharing your experiences, for sharing the great work that you're doing, as an AWS community hero and all of the open source packages. If people want to contact you or look up anything from the open source side or for your blogs, where should they look?
Yeah, sure. So I'm available on Twitter, LinkedIn, or GitHub at IANN0036.
0036. And that's your GitHub or your Twitter or your LinkedIn, use that?
That's right. Yep.
Awesome. And where's your blog for your security research?
And my blog is at onecloudplease.com.
onecloudplease.com. There you go. Well, Ian McKay, thank you again so much for taking the time to join us on the Modern Cyber Podcast. We will talk to you next time.
Thank you so much.